Canoe, it would have been a lot sharper.
Okay, so more like an axe than a hammer.
Yeah, it's an axe.
Okay.
This is a scraper.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful tool, repointing along here. It's still razor sharp after all these years.
So a scraper is something that might have been used for butchering?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Or for scraping a piece of meat, or again, for woodworking, because remember the canoes are really important to them. What we have here is the lip of a conch shell. As simple as this looks, you take this, and then this is the first phase, and you cut along here. It's the thinnest part. If you notice the middle is thicker, it gets really thin. You break along there, and you sharpen this end, and you have a beautiful axe. But the interesting thing about this site, though, is also in all of this we're finding a European thimble. I mean, I don't think they used thimbles back then, but it's a very old thimble.
It's a classic sailor's tool. They had a sailor's palm to drive big needles through canvas, but also smaller ones to do smaller, more delicate work.
Repair their uniforms, sew up your buttons and all sorts of things. So this is an amazing artifact.
It may seem like an innocuous clue, but for me, that thimble immediately takes you on board one of those frigates lying out in the bay.
A tiny thimble might seem like a strange object to associate with a sailor on a massive warship. Yes, ships like these were built for war, the hulls 3 feet thick to protect the sailors from enemy shot, and bristling with cannon. But they were also the sailors' home. The ship's weather deck would have been a hive of activity. Men cleaning the deck, exercising at gun drill, and queuing to go aloft to trim the sails. The very best of those men would have carried a thimble in their pocket. And what a home it must have been. Hundreds of men living together on a gun deck like this, with very little access to fresh air or light, in a space that is shared with livestock. And then you get sent to the Caribbean, where the heat from the tropics turns the fresh food rancid and the water green with slime. The further forward you come in a ship, the more cramped and dark it becomes. But it's up here, beyond the hammocks, underneath the forecastle, where a sailor might find a little space for himself in a gap between watches to write a letter home or to mend his tattered clothes, perhaps with a tiny copper thimble. After months of living in these conditions, you can just imagine how desperate people would have been to get off their ship and feel dry land beneath their feet.
However, shore leave was a rare commodity. Desertion was extremely common, so most sailors who arrived in English Harbour would hardly ever have left their ship except under strict controls, unless, of course, they were sick or dead. At the dig site, there's an air of disappointment. Reggie's excavation, although full of interesting prehistoric artefacts, failed to unearth any of the hoped-for sailors' remains. However, right at the end of the day, there have been some significant developments in the second trench. Fragments of a body are beginning to emerge. Professor Tamara Varney from Lakehead University, Ontario, is one of the senior archaeologists on the dig.
How have you been getting on?
Good. We're just packing up for the day, and so we backfilled a little bit of the site of the unit so that there's not bones going to be unprotected overnight. And so what we found in this corner is we found a foot, and it's in very bad shape. So we've just had a very light cover over it.
And what's under the mysterious yellow tray?
This is a very scientific hiding device, which hides this very poorly preserved skull.
Wow.
Here. And this is probably not related to that leg bone there.
Because it's on a different layer, is that how you work that out?
Yeah. And what we have removed from there, though, because we don't want them to go missing because they're so exciting, are some buttons that Paula found.
These two buttons, the first one that we found was found in the screening of some of the sand we removed from the site. And the second one we found up against the shin bone. And they are very exciting. They're lovely buttons. The back is brass, and the front is has some mother of pearl inlay.
So that suggests maybe quite a high-status burial?
It could suggest that this individual that they were found with was of higher rank than some of the other sailors.
Yeah, what's really exciting about these buttons is that they are a little more ornate than the buttons we've typically found at military sites in the past. And with this mother of pearl inlay, it's just a lot more elaborate than a plain homemade bone button or shell button, which were typically found on sort of undergarments or pants and shirts. And so that leads us to believe that there's somebody of probably higher rank than the other sailors that we've uncovered at this site and at a nearby Royal Navy Hospital cemetery.
So who did these buttons belong to? They're not from a naval uniform. Perhaps they belonged to a gentleman passenger. Perhaps a planter off to visit his estate. What's remarkable is that so much of the landscape and buildings that their owner would have seen if he had made it on shore alive are still being used today, just as they would have been 250 years ago. One extraordinary relic from the 18th century that's still beautifully preserved is this enormous water collecting tank.
There are no rivers or lakes on Antigua. All of the fresh water they use to drink, to cook, to clean had to come from the sky. Water pours down this slope into vast collection chambers underneath. And sailors would then roll their barrels up here and fill them up and take them back to the ships.
But what's really remarkable is the graffiti that survives on the surrounding walls.
It's a magnificent resource because handwriting is so personal. You get a real sense of the people who are here. Here we've got John Webb, who's chosen to carve his name deep using very straight lines and a very clear O there. Further up, we've got James Gates, who's used a much more cursive hand. The ship Roebuck here, another date, 1743 here. E.G., 1740. Down here, I.D.W.H. in 1748. It's almost like what you would do on the walls in a prison. These men are putting their marks here. They're saying that they've been here. They're saying that they've endured. They're saying that they've survived.
After 3 days' work at the excavation unit, a miraculously complete figure has appeared in the sand. Matt Brown is a bioarchaeologist from City University, New York.
We managed to uncover the skeleton that we identified earlier today, or yesterday. If you look at where the hands are, they're actually laid over the pelvis area.
He looks very neat.
Yes,
Doesn't
he? Yeah. And from what I understand, sometimes they'd wrap them in their hammocks. So maybe that helped to keep the individual in line.
But that makes sense. You can almost see the shape of him being squashed together by his hammock, and his head's almost slightly raised, hunched forward. Can you give me a rough idea of what kind of period we're looking at?
As far as dating the individual skeleton, you'd likely want to have some kind of artifacts, that kind of thing, that would go along with the skeleton to give you some idea of a date. But as of right now, we don't have any kind of evidence of any kind of artifacts here.
So the mother of pearl buttons that we found at the end of the day yesterday, they're actually from a different layer.
They're from a different layer and probably a different individual.
So probably someone completely different.
Yeah.
So it kind of emphasises the complexity of this site.
Yeah, definitely.
So Corey, what's going on up this end?
So what we are doing is we're just starting to uncover a part of the mandible here. You can see it's just the teeth, which are still intact in some areas right here. So
it's incredibly vivid, isn't it? When the teeth emerge, it makes it so much more human almost.
absolutely, and you can just see right away that there's a bit of dental wear on it, so you can see from normal use. So it's really nice to see that we have something there that can be added to all the other ways of which you can age, or at least use different age composites to look at.
Well, we've come to the end of 3 really hard days digging, and there still seems so much more that we need to do. And as always with archaeology, there's a limited time frame within which to do it. And we've pulled all of these skeletal remains from a trench no more than 2 meters squared, and it's only the second trench that we've dug. And there's more material coming up all the time, and we simply don't know what's going to come next. And such a wealth of material from such a confined space really makes you think about the complexity of the human story that played itself out here.
Naval life in the tropics was undoubtedly arduous and dangerous. But what was the island itself like? 30 minutes drive inland, another archaeological dig is underway, excavating one of Antigua's first and largest sugar plantations. British sailors who came here in the 18th century were well aware that the island was wholly given over to the brutal business of industrial-scale sugar cultivation. The whole island was a sea of cane, and if anyone lived a hellish existence here, it was undoubtedly the hundreds of thousands of slaves who were sent here from West Africa. Betty's Hope Plantation was founded in the mid-1600s by one of the island's earliest colonisers, Sir Christopher Codrington. The archaeological investigation of the Codrington plantation is headed by Californian professor Georgia Fox. Working with a team of students, she's currently excavating the main planter's house.
The scale of the industry, the plantation at one time was about 700 acres. And of course, there's a whole cadre of people working here, the managers, overseers, the servants, and about 400 slaves. So it was a huge operation. It was an industrial complex.
We escaped from the dust and sun into one of the old sugar crushing windmills.
So what's the purpose of the excavation at the moment?
Well, this is the first plantation house to be excavated on Antigua. So it's important for local island history. But there are so few plantations that have been fully excavated in the Caribbean region. There still needs a lot of work to be done to understand how plantations function. Historians write about plantations and plantation life, but the archaeology fleshes out those details through the excavation of the material culture, the buildings, the artifacts, and so they might tell us a slightly different story. We don't know. The artifacts don't lie. We have a whole complex of support buildings to the north of the Great House, which included a servant's quarters, a doctor's office, the overseer's office, and other buildings, which we're looking for now. And then we're also looking for the original slave housing, the pre-emancipation slave housing.
And would that slave housing have been nearby, or was that in a slightly separate location?
Yes, it would have been nearby because the planters always wanted to keep an eye on their slaves. But at the end of the day, we're also trying to look at not just the plantation as a system, but trying to understand, the lives of the people who lived and worked here, whether they were the owners or the slaves. And so we want to have a more holistic picture of plantation life.
Central to the work at Betty's Hope is a search for more detailed archaeological information about slave life. A few shards of rough slave pottery have been unearthed, but there is precious little solid evidence of their homes, culture, or experiences. On an island where the majority of the population are descended from slaves, a more detailed and forensic understanding of slavery on the plantations is essential in helping future generations of Antiguans develop a proper understanding of the darkest part of their national story.
We've just had a phone call from the guys excavating down on the beach, and they've started to uncover another skeleton in the same trench. So we're heading back to English Harbour as quickly as we can.
It's a bit of a jumble, as you can tell. We've got a lot of different bones popping up in places that are not anatomically correct. So we've got some fibula over here, another fibula down here, bits of pelvic bone over here. We are finding a lot of coffin nails, though, which is very interesting. So I actually just found one here, and we've got one here, two over here. One is actually in a jumble of pelvic bones. And this is the individual that we're pretty confident was associated with the buttons that we found the other day, those fancy buttons.
So in total, how many buttons have we found then?
We found a total of 5 buttons, which is pretty exciting. And they're kind of across the individual, but as I said, the individual's pretty jumbled up, so can't really infer too much about the placement of the buttons at the moment.
Each bone from the site is carefully removed and wrapped to be taken for analysis by Tamara in the project workshop.
Since I've been working in Antigua for the last 15 years, I've been specifically interested in the British Navy in Antigua and how they lived here and how they adapted to life in the Caribbean. They're dealing with the heat, they're dealing with lack of water, sometimes lack of rations, that sort of thing.
Central to Tamara's analysis is a detailed examination of diet as revealed by the mineral content in each individual set of bones.
I also do what we call archaeological bone chemistry. And so I investigate what they were eating over their lifetimes and if that diet changed once they got to Antigua.
1, 2, 3.
Initially, my work was basically looking at elemental components of diet, which are later transformed into body tissues. And because you essentially are what you eat, you can get a very generalized look at what people were eating. And people coming from Britain would have been eating a very different diet than people living in the Caribbean or slaves being transported from Africa. And in that way, I can separate the Europeans from the Africans.
Working on bone samples taken during an earlier dig at the site of the cemetery of the Naval Hospital in English Harbour, Tamara was able to confirm that Europeans and Africans were buried alongside one another, contradicting some of the notions of racial segregation in the 18th century Caribbean.
One of the interesting things about the Naval Hospital Cemetery that I dug a few years back is that there were people of African and European ancestry. And you can really see how when the Navy brought sailors and soldiers here, that they didn't live as long as the Africans. It's astonishing how young many of the sailors and soldiers are when we estimate their age at death from their bones.
Seeing these bones being taken out of the ground with such delicacy and care really makes you wonder whether the bodies were put into the ground in the first place with any ceremony and dignity. And these men were husbands, they were sons, they were fathers. Were their families ever told what had become of them? Were they ever told where they'd been buried? And the longer I spend at this dig, it's clear that this is far more than just a scientific exercise. And there's a human tragedy here that we need to understand.
The first skeleton from the dig has now been laid out in Tamara's workshop for preliminary analysis.
So Tamara, what can you tell us about him?
Well, I can tell you that he was in his late 30s when he died, and he's male, and he was about 4'11", 5 foot in stature.
So what are you actually specifically looking at when you're gauging the age of a skeleton?
We're looking to see how rugged it is and how much porosity is there and how dense the surfaces are.
And on a much younger skeleton, what does it look like? Is it shiny or?
It would be much more rugged and,
more rugged.
And a little more coarse.
So this is very much the first stage and where you plan to go forward. So
Yes.
what do you do next?
What I'll do next is examine each one of the bones a little more carefully to see if there's any subtle traces that indicate something about health.
Can you get indication of disease maybe being a cause of death?
You know, it's very rare to be able to find an indicator of cause of death, because cause of death is usually from some sort of soft tissue cause. What we might be able to deduce is if he had a traumatic death or if it was a disease which left a lot of indication on bone, which I can already say is probably not. It was probably an acute cause of death.
The main work on this skeleton will take place back in her lab in Canada, where Tamara is keen to pursue a new line of research looking at the phenomenon of lead poisoning amongst the Caribbean sailors.
One of the historical questions has been what led to the high mortality rate of the Royal Navy and military in the West Indies. And one of the historical sort of hypotheses is a combination of alcoholism and lead poisoning, and with lead poisoning coming from the alcohol.
The most important byproduct of sugar production is rum. And rum, after sugar, is the most important export of the sugar islands. Rum is an extremely important part of local life on the islands, and planters were renowned for their high living and their drunken antics and behaviour.
Rum was also regularly doled out to the slaves. But the greatest consumers of rum on Antigua would have been the sailors and soldiers, for whom it was the anaesthetic of choice.
This is a very old bottle would have likely held rum. We know that every sailor got his traditional pint a day served in 2 batches mixed with lime and water. So the grog was a very traditional naval drink, and they had to have it. In fact, we find an old poster advertising for 200,000 gallons of rum in Antigua to be purchased to supply the military forces in the Eastern Caribbean islands. Also, remember, they're surrounded by plantations. Cheap rum, new rum especially, the first distillation was really cheap. I think this rum was probably very poisonous. All the piping, all the tubes, all the worms that have been distilled, the rum's being distilled in, is made of lead. And we know from the records that they drank a lot of it in addition to their rations. You know, they're probably taking themselves to an early grave with lead poisoning. And of course, once you get sick, you get sent to the hospital to treat the dry belly ache and the flux they all complained about was probably caused by lead poisoning from the rum. And again, when you get, bleed you, the only treatment they had was bleeding, blistering, and mercury. That doesn't really help the lead in your body if that is the problem. There was something a little bit more to it than the yellow fever malaria. I think rum was seriously poisonous.
It's this lead content in the rum and its absorption into the sailors' bones that has been the subject of Tamara Varney's most recent research.
I've been working with some new technology called a synchrotron, which is basically a large atom accelerator that creates brilliant, brilliant light, which allows us to take our analysis to levels which was previously not possible. And with that, we can look at not just the amount of lead that's been accumulated into bone over a lifetime, but we can actually look at the distribution of that lead inside the bone, and if it's been incorporated into the bone as opposed to just being a contaminant from the burial environment.
Tamara's research indicates that, thanks to the rum, young British men were heavily poisoned with lead while they were in Antigua. This would have compromised their immune systems, making them especially vulnerable to whatever tropical diseases they encountered. It's another fragment of information that only adds to the grim picture of naval life that sailors, like those now appearing in increasing numbers in the excavation trenches, would have endured.
So, Sam, we've got another extraordinary jumble of bones here. Can you tell me what's going on?
Sure. Well, right now you're looking at least 6 individuals.
6?
Yes.
Crikey, so that's 6 more from what we've already discovered?
Yes.
All in this one small area?
Yes. So right here we've got an individual, and you're seeing 2 lower leg bones coming out.
Yeah.
Down here, further, we've got 2 feet, and they're beautifully preserved, and they're just
poking out of the sand. They've just been chucked on top of each other.
Yeah, they're just, someone was definitely lying down with their feet up in the air. And with these, we've got another one of our fancy buttons and a coffin nail. Here we've got what looks like a very well-preserved skeleton coming out. We're very excited about this one. This is burial number 4, and you can see we've got 2 patellas here. Those are the knee bones.
Very neatly placed together.
Yes, absolutely. And you've got a bit of the pelvis and the spine coming up. So this looks like it's going to be a really great find. So we're going to work on this area next and see where it goes from there.
Amongst this collection of bones was an unexpected and disconcerting discovery.
There.
So what we're looking at with the 6 individuals that you saw in the trench is we're looking at adult and some subadult, or people that are juveniles and children.
So there were kids in there?
Yes, there certainly were. And on ship there were children and young boys that were apprenticed on the ships.
Do you get a sense of what sort of age we're talking about here?
One is under 14 and one is definitely under 16. You can tell that from which growth plates are not fused, but we haven't really had a good look at them as yet.
So there's more to come, but we think
Yes.
there are children buried amongst fully grown adults.
Yes.
We know that boys were commonly employed on ships as servants. as top men in the rigging and as powder monkeys during battle. But these juvenile skeletons are still a poignant discovery, and one that further contributes to the identification of the bodies as sailors. What's going to be much harder to pin down is the ship that they came from. Thanks to naval records, we know that one vessel, whose crew seems unlikely to have buried any of its number on Galleon Beach, was Horatio Nelson's HMS Boreas.
Nelson did actually quite well during this 3 or 4 years in the Boreas. He suffered very few casualties through fevers. And scurvy wasn't a problem for him, because being in one of the upsides of being in port so often was, of course, you did have ready access to fresh provisions, water, fruit, vegetables, these sort of things, which became much more problematic when you were on deep sea journeys. So the scurvy problem wasn't such a great one, and he managed to avoid the fevers. It was a difficult command, and Nelson did try to bring to it elements that would make it more tolerable. One of the things he used to persuade sailors to do was to involve themselves in amateur dramatics. They used to devise plays. They used to dress up and perform these plays, and Nelson and the officers would go and watch them. And it was interesting to see men capering about in women's dresses and going through this type of performance. He also encouraged dancing and juggling and various other activities.
The main reason for the health of Nelson's crew was probably not the dancing, but the relative peace in the Caribbean in the mid-1780s. The worst outbreaks of disease occurred during times of war, and it was during the years immediately after Nelson was in Antigua, in the 1790s, that the island witnessed the most intense period of militarisation. Thanks to Britain's war with revolutionary France, Antigua became the most heavily fortified island in the region, and a garrison for up to 5,000 troops.
The arrival of large numbers of Europeans into Caribbean port towns, which is exactly what happens when you get battalions of troops arriving from Europe. Europeans without any previous exposure to yellow fever, who've built up no immunity to tropical fevers, all arriving at one time in one place, create the perfect conditions for fever to tear through their ranks.
And this is exactly what happened in the early 1790s. The revolution in France created turmoil in her colonies in the Caribbean, and France's largest and most lucrative possession, Saint-Domingue, witnessed a violent and successful slave-led revolution. French and British troops poured into the Caribbean as the conflict spread, although many of them never made it into battle. By far the majority of the ensuing casualties were caused by tropical fever.
English Harbour was notorious for disease and became known as one of the most unhealthy spots in the Caribbean. But it's likely that many of the sailors buried on Galleon Beach were dead before they even arrived in Antigua. An extraordinary account survives of one ship that arrived in May 1793, HMS Experiment.
HMS Experiment was a warship that had recently visited the port of St. George in Grenada. During her stay there, she appears to have been infected by a ship newly arrived from West Africa with a virulent strain of yellow fever known as Boulam fever. Shortly after contagion, the Experiment was instructed by the Admiralty to assume duties patrolling the waters around St. Kitts and Antigua. I managed to track down the naval documents relating to HMS Experiment. The journal of the proceedings of His Majesty's ship Experiment, kept by her captain, Simon Miller. She was sailing off Dominica. She'd left Grenada, and she's 42 miles to the north of Dominica when things start to go wrong. He notes here, company very sickly. The next day, after some entries about the day-to-day life of the ship, again he's put ship's company very sickly. You can tell he's a man who's starting to get really worried about what's happening. The day after that, departed this life, Richard Ellis, at 11 committed his body to the deep. These entries continue for a number of days. Ship's company sickly. Again, that was just a day after they'd buried Richard Ellis at sea. Then something really interesting happens. Discipline starts to break down on board. The captain has to punish Daniel Denton with 12 lashes for contempt. And the next day, he's punished another sailor called Jonathan Munro, this time with 36 lashes for theft. They're still sailing from Dominica towards Antigua. And then once again, on the same day, 11, departed this life, Thomas Woollingley. At midnight, committed his body to the deep. And the very next day, he has to punish Henry Wood with 12 lashes for neglect.
By the time the Experiment arrived at the mouth of English Harbour, she was like a ghost ship. The few surviving men on board her, incapable of bringing her in. One of the defensive strengths of this harbour is the narrowness of the inlet, but it made the whole process of actually getting in incredibly difficult for these massive and cumbersome sailing warships. To help them, they'd run lines ashore and wrap them around strong points like this. It's a cannon sunk into the stone. Now, this was far beyond anything that the crew of the Experiment could cope with, so they made a signal for assistance. And a crew from the frigate Sol Bay rowed out to help. It was an act of suicide. Every single member of that rescue party was infected and died.
The muster books of the Experiment and the Sol Bay, the lists of men on board, paint a vivid picture of the rapid demise of the ship's crews.
Richard Warren, discharged dead. Charles Norburn, discharged dead. Thomas Rowston, Robert Tozer, Francis Juno, William Sutherland, Jonathan Leach, George Cook, William Tiller, Sam Dyer, Robert Giles, all dead. Now here too we have the boatswain, who was Thomas Carrington. He's recorded as having 2 servants. So these would have been 2 boys learning the trade of the boatswain. Jonathan Burnett, discharged dead on the 21st of October. And another boatswain's servant, David Richards. He died on exactly the same day. It just makes you wonder if these are the boys that are buried on Galleon Beach.
We'll never know exactly who the bones now being excavated belonged to, but over 200 sailors from the Experiment, the Sol Bay and other infected ships died in the Boulam fever epidemic in English Harbour towards the end of 1793. And it's more than likely that the bodies of Francis Juno, Robert Tozer, Richard Warren, Jonathan Burnett and all the others were hurriedly disposed of here on the sand dunes. The full extent of this beach burial site, however, is unclear, and for now it will have to remain a subject for speculation, as this dig is now beginning to wind up.
Yesterday we found those 2 perfect feet just sticking out of the sand.
Yeah.
What happened to them?
But we decided, based on the amount of time we have left for this dig, that it's better to leave this individual in situ or in place, because we actually found that this individual extended further, and we'd actually have to cut this all the way back to remove, or to expose it at least.
So when we leave this trench, there's still going to be more archaeological material left?
Yeah, there's still going to be individuals here. And it's better that way, that you don't want to take individuals out if you don't have, the space or the time to actually do the analysis.
But do you think we've recovered sufficient material to be able to tell this story adequately well?
I think depending on the analysis that are going to be run, as far as sailors, you have a large span or a large range of individuals on these boats coming in. If they are dying of disease, it's not just affecting older individuals, it's affecting all age groups.
Time has run out for the archaeologists. They're leaving at least 2 unexcavated skeletons in the ground, and they are now pretty confident that there are many more, perhaps hundreds of bodies buried in this sand dune. For the benefit of future archaeologists returning to this fascinating site, the team are leaving a message behind, a simple clue that this small patch has already been dug. We know that some of the sailors who came to Antigua in the 18th century did enjoy the warm seas, the fresh fish, the Caribbean colours, the fruit, the rum. But the brutality of naval life, the overwhelming heat, and the constant fear of disease on this polluted, heavily militarised, factory farm slave island undoubtedly turned Antigua into a kind of hell for most of the men and women who ended up here. But what about Nelson? He had no qualms about the business of the island. As a senior officer, his comforts and living conditions were far easier than they were for his crew. He didn't suffer from sickness until the end of his Caribbean posting. So what made him quite so miserable in English Harbour? The answer was boredom, frustration, and a girl called Mary Moutray. English Harbour was a tiny settlement, but the resident British Commodore, Sir John Moutray, had an attractive wife 30 years his junior.
Moutray's house, wishfully known as Windsor, was up here on the hill behind the dockyard, where you can feel the breeze coming in from the open sea. And it was at Windsor where Nelson and his good friend Cuthbert Collingwood found a measure of respite from their naval duties in the company of Moutray's beguiling young wife.
Unfortunately, it was a short-lived friendship.
Mary left Antigua with her husband in the late spring of '85. So Nelson only knew her for really between August and May. But it actually almost destroyed him. He talks in his letters about her being the most amiable person that he had ever known. He was absolutely lost. And the first time he went back to English Harbour after she left, he walked up the hill to the house, and he was so distraught of the sight of this place, where, as he said, I've spent more happy hours here than anywhere else.
He wrote to his brother, "This country appears now intolerable, my dear friend being absent. It is barren indeed. English Harbour